Well, hello. Thanks for coming back to check out another video. So, we are here today to sit down and talk about the eyeshadow palettes that are on my chopping block. So if you will recall, I think it's been about 3 weeks since I posted like, hey, these are 10 palettes that are on my chopping block. Like, I'm on the fence about whether or not I want to keep them in my collection. So I am just trying to hone in, focus in on these 10 eyeshadow palettes and try to do 2 to 3 eye looks with each of them before the end of the year. That way I can decide if they have a home within my collection. So I will leave that video linked down in the description box, like the introduction where I go over all 10 palettes just in case you missed it or you want a little bit of a refresher. But I did decide to just kind of do these in groups, that way I didn't feel so overwhelmed. So the first grouping was these 4 eyeshadows. We have the Persona Identity palette, the Lorac Mega Pro 1, the Melt Amor Mariposas, and the Nomad Haunted Europe palette. So if you want to see how all of these fared, I have made final judgment calls on all of these, then, just stick around. I'm going to leave chapters for you guys down in the description box so that you can skip around and see if there's only like one thing you're interested in hearing me talk about. Alright, so let's first talk about these 2 eyeshadow palettes. So we have the Persona Identity 1 palette and the Lorac Mega Pro 1 palette. So these 2 were not in here because they're palettes that I was on the fence about, where I was like, do I like you or do I not? I actually really do like both of these eyeshadow palettes. The reason that they were in here for me to use and to kind of scrutinize was because I felt like they might be going bad. Like, I was suffering from allergies, and so I have very itchy, watery eyes. But now that we're into fall, like, my eyes are much better, and I can really distinguish a difference between allergies versus like something is irritating my eyes. So I thought it was the perfect time to kind of really test these ones out. So this is the inside of the Persona Identity palette. You can see I have got a lot of use out of this. I've completely panned 3 shades, and I've panned on 4 other shades within this. We have been through some things, and it really pains me to say that when I pulled this out to use it, I only got 2 eyeshadows onto my lids before it was like this intense, itchy, burning feeling, and my eyes were just pouring water. And I was like, you know what? No, I'm not like fooling with this. I hate to see it go, but I do think that unfortunately this palette has expired. I did pick this up pretty soon after the launch date, so I think that's been like, what, 2 to 3 years ago. So like I said, I don't feel as bad having to part with this and unfortunately throw it into the bin, because we have been through some things. We've, had a lot of good times together, and I do feel like I did get my money's worth out of this eyeshadow palette. Alright, so then along that same vein with the Lorac Mega Pro 1, again, like, I put on, I think, just 1 eyeshadow from this palette and started having like the same kind of reaction, just that really intense, burning, itchy feeling. And I was like, nope, we're not playing with this. Like, you already got 1 bad eye, you only have 1 good eye left. Like, let's try to save it, right? So this one has not nearly gotten as much use as the Persona one. I do have 3 pans of eyeshadow within this palette though, and a lot of good dips within some of these other shades. So while this one hasn't gotten as much use, like, I feel okay parting with it. My mother had this in her collection, and I honestly don't know how long she had it before she passed it on to me, so there's no telling the age of this. But yeah, I also, like, when you look at this, it's just a standard neutral palette. So while it's really pretty, and I do enjoy the Lorac formula, even like this older formula as well as their new formula, it's just, there's not really much to write home about here. Like, it's a neutral palette, you know what I mean? I have these shades time and time again in my collection, so I'm not really sad to see this one go, but I am sad to kind of see this one go, just because this one was so good and like one of my few cool tone neutral eyeshadow palettes. But these will both be going into the bin, and I did not take any pictures using them because, like I said, I only got like 1 to 2 shadows onto my eyes before they just started watering, so I didn't really feel like taking a picture. Alright, so I did scoot over so that I could insert pictures with all of these palettes of eye looks that I did do. Now, I'm not going to go in depth over the pictures. I'm just going to kind of talk about my thoughts of the palette and what its fate is as the pictures are running over the screen here. I did leave the shade names on the pictures though, so if you were curious, but if you have like a question or you want like a little bit more of like an in-depth explanation, feel free to sound off in the comment section and I will try my best to answer your question about any eye look that you have. So I am waving this palette around, so let's talk about the Melt Amor Mariposas palette next. Now this one was one that I did want to pull out to try to test out during this time, because it is fall and this is very much a fall color story in my opinion. You have some really pretty like red, orangey, and pink shades, as well as these purples. You've got a really nice like brown shade up here, and then these greens. So my issues with this palette was, one, the price tag, the $70. I did not think that that was worth it, but I think that the $70 is like that huge price tag is what was keeping me from being able to like officially part ways with this, because I just wanted to make sure that I really tested it out and highly scrutinized it because of that price tag. And then the other reason that, you know, it was in here on the chopping block was because I felt like if I played it safe and just stuck to like one color family, so if I used just the purples, or, you know, just like the pinky reds, or just the greens, my eye look was fine. Like it was, you know, it was okay. But when I tried to explore and like do more creative things with this palette, so like taking the purples and doing them with the greens, I just felt like my eye look became super muddy and patchy, and it just was not like a fun time. Some things that I have learned in using this palette. One, I think that using my smaller eye brushes, so I have some brushes from Refer as well as Blend Bunny, and they are very small blending brushes. Using those is a lot better with this palette, because then I'm able to maintain more control over my eye look. I am able to work in a smaller area, because I feel like when you do big sweeping motions with the colors within this palette, that's when they're going to blend away and become like patchy and muddy and just not work out all that well. So that was my first tip. Then also I noticed that with the shimmer shadows in here, they apply better with like a more fluffy brush as opposed to like a dense packing brush that I feel like a lot of us use when we do, you know, put on shimmer shadows. So the fluffy brush really helped to, I guess, pick up more of the shimmer shadow, and then I was able to like pack it on. Now using a fluffy brush, you're gonna get a lot of fallout, but it's easily wiped away. I also figured out that when using this palette, if I did want to mix and match, so say do like the purples and the greens together, it is best to start out with your darkest shadow first and then work out to your lightest shadow, as opposed to going from lightest to darkest, which is typically how I do like to use my, or do my makeup. So it's a little bit of like, takes a little bit longer to think about a look and to really plan it out if you're going from darkest to lightest, for me personally, just because, like I said, it's reverse order of what I normally do. But having figured all of those things out, like I do have to say, I really enjoyed the eye looks that I got from this palette. I think my favorite one was one where I did more of like the greens and paired it with some of the golds. Like to me, it came across as like a very neutral eye look. But I just had a lot of fun with it, because I was finally able to successfully pair these greens and get them to be the color payoff that I wanted, and pair it with like this brown shade down here. That's the other thing too, I guess, that I forgot to mention with this palette that I noticed, is that a packing motion works best with their matte shadows. So instead of like dipping your brush in and just going right into doing like the sweeping motions, it's better to like pack it out, or pack it where you want that shade, get your placement that down, and then just lightly blend out the edges of it. Oh, I'm sorry, this eye is watering a little bit because we are not quite yet done with allergies, apparently. So, in saying all of that, I guess you were wondering the fate of this palette, and I have to say, I think this will be my only melt palette that I ever purchase and own. I am going to keep it because, like I said, now that I've figured out ways that work for me to use this palette, I really did enjoy the 3 eye looks that I got from this. I don't think that this will ever be like a standout favorite palette within my collection, because the formula is a little bit more tricky, but I am happy that I put it to the test and really did scrutinize it before just like decluttering it, you know, without giving it that heavy scrutinization. Now, I still don't think that it was worth the $70 price tag, because it is so fussy. I feel like a lot of what you're paying for is the melt name and the packaging, because the packaging is very like hefty. Like this does feel very nice, and there is like a very nice mirror in here. But yeah, while I will be keeping this, this will be my only melt palette. So I was noticing, like, that's why I kind of paused there. I didn't really think about it, but all of my palettes, like the mirrors of them, I have never pulled off the like little plastic protector. All of my palettes still have those on them, and that probably is gonna get on some of y'all's nerves just knowing that. So yeah, anyway, let's get into it and talk about the Nomad Haunted Europe palette. Now I only have 2 eye looks to show you like pictures of, because my eye look today I am using this palette, so I felt like it was fair to come on here and film this update video since I did technically have 3 eye looks from this palette. So, Haunted Europe. I will open this up for you guys. You know, I have to give it to Nomad. They really do have some of the most interesting color stories, and the theming is always on point, and I have to say, I'm always sucked in by their new releases. Like, they just look so good and so fun. The reason why I had this palette in here on my chopping block, I had never used this palette, so I really did want to put it to, you know, the test and the scrutiny. But I have the America's Parks palette from Nomad, and I just, based off the America's Parks palette, I feel like the mattes are not buildable and the shimmers are not impactful. And that's not to say it's a bad formula, because not everyone wants a bam, in-your-face eyeshadow shimmer shade like I personally do. So I understand that there's an audience for it, you know, but it's just not my preferred formula. So the America's Parks palette, which is also in on the chopping block, did kind of put a bad taste in my mouth, so I just like held off on using this one. Now that I have used it and played around with it, I have to say, this eye look that I have on right now, this halo eye, is my favorite that I have done with this palette. I still feel like the shimmer shadows in here are not that impactful. I tried laying them down with NYX glitter glue, concealer, and even spraying my shadows. I am not a huge fan of spraying my shadows. I just feel like they get hard pan in them. Like, I don't spray directly into the pan. You know, I pick it up on the brush and then spray the brush, use it, and then go back in for, you know, a second round to do the second eye. But I just feel like I always get hard pan, so it's not my preferred method. But either way, with the shimmer shadows, what I found was much like with the Melt palette, if you use a fluffy kind of, almost like what you would think of to like do maybe a lower lash line, or, you know, buff out some of the edges, if you just use a fluffier brush to pick up the shimmers, I feel like it goes a little bit better, and they do apply, you know, more evenly, and they're a little bit more impactful. Then with the mattes within this palette, I feel like they did layer quite nicely. I feel like I did not have to work from darkest to lightest. I could go from lightest to darkest, which again is my preferred method. I think one of the biggest reasons though that it works for this palette compared to the America's Parks palette is that a lot of the colors in here are of the same color family. You know what I mean? So these like purpley shadows down here, I know that in one look I used those with like this kind of blue shade, which this blue shade turns out more of like a gray blue, but these purples are also more on like the gray side, like a gray purple side. So they're in that same color family, so I feel like by them being in the same color family, they're going to be easier to layer up and blend out and not have them become like muddy or patchy or anything like that. Whereas with the America's Parks palette, like the matte shadows, they don't necessarily all of them like belong to the same color family, and so it is a little bit harder to like combine them, like combine that red and that brown. Does that hopefully make sense? So either way, with this palette though, I do have to say I do enjoy this one. I think that much like the Melt palette, I don't think that this will ever be a favorite, but I do like how dark this is. I like what you get in this palette, like as far as the color selection goes. So I am actually going to hang on to this palette. I'm curious to see now how many times like throughout the year I will reach for both of these palettes, because I do know better ways to like work with them and use them. So yeah, maybe, I don't know, I'm not saying they'll stay in my collection forever, but through doing them on the chopping block, I have found ways to make them work, ways that I enjoy them, and I would like to keep them in my collection and just see how much more I like actually play with them. Alright, so let's also talk about another palette that was in on the chopping block that I'm just not going to fool with. So this is from Oden. This is part of their Älva II collection. This was the Mini Ocean palette. Now this was one that I got in a mystery box. I just, you know, I pulled this one out because after the Lorac and the Persona palettes didn't work out, like they just made my eyes irritated too much, so I decided to put them in the bin. I figured, well, instead of just getting on here and talking about Haunted Europe and Melt, let me try to knock this palette out, because this is only a 6-pan palette, so if I did 1 or 2 looks with this, I would be really happy, and I feel like I could make a safe assessment over my thoughts with this palette. But every time I like went to pull this out, went to use this, I just felt super uninspired. Like, I did not want to. It would like, I would have to push myself to even want to try to use this. And so I just sat there and was like, Haley, this is silly. Like, if you feel that way about a palette, you really shouldn't keep it. Like, if you're actually having to force yourself to use it, like, it's just not a palette that's for you. So it does sadden me a little bit because I do like the Oden's Eye formula. I think that with each palette they release, their formula does get a little bit better. I really don't like the split pan in here. I wish that this would have just been a traditional 6-pan palette and you separated out this blue and this like purple shade. I was just always afraid that I was going to mess them up and like ruin the shadow in the center. And then the other thing, I've always talked about how like the color story of this throws me off because it's the blues and then these oranges, and it still does. It still very much throws me off. But I do just want to point out the like oranges down here are more of like a burnt orange kind of shade. And I do like mixing blues and oranges together. It is one of my favorite color combinations. So these blues are right up my alley and what I would want for that, but not the oranges. I definitely want like a brighter, like in your face orange to mix with darker blue shades. So I just never really got behind this palette. I don't see a point in forcing myself to use this when I could pass this on to someone who is actually going to enjoy it. Alright, so to wrap this video up, let me talk about the 2 palettes that I would like to try to use here in the next few weeks. Again, do 2 to 3 looks with them, and then once I've completed that, come back on here and talk to you guys about like my assessments and my findings. So the reasons that I picked these 2 eyeshadow palettes is because these are the ones that, again, give me the most fall vibes out of the ones that are on the chopping block. And then 2, I only want to bring in 2 because I do want to do more eyeshadow centered like content on my channel and, you know, film more types of videos like that. And so I feel like if I only have 2 palettes in on the chopping block that I'm like essentially forcing myself to use and to scrutinize, I'll be able to actually play around with more of my collection and film more like eyeshadow centered things. So anyway, I am going to bring in the America's Parks palette, which is from Nomad. So open this one up. I feel like this one too is a fall color story, but on the different, like on the opposite end of the spectrum in the way that Haunted Europe is. Like Haunted Europe is very dark and grungy, and I feel like this one, while it does go from light to dark, is a little bit more of like a brighter, you know, color palette. So like I said, with the Nomad formula, I just feel like the shimmers aren't as impactful, but now that I know the trick with like the more fluffy brush and the shimmer shades, I'm interested to see how this palette turns out. Now I have to say, this shadow down here, the Narrows, it's kind of like this rosy, bronzy kind of shade. I don't know if you can see that. I will try to swatch it out for you. This shadow has always been my favorite. I've never had an issue out of this shadow, and I love that it has like some like golden flecks to it. So I'm gonna be a little sad if I end up not keeping this palette simply because I do love this shade, the Narrows, so much, but you cannot keep a palette for one shade, you know what I mean? Alright, and then the second palette that I would like to try to use, you know, in the next month to get my looks in is from Juvia's Place. So this is the Tribe palette. Now the background of this is super reflective, so I do apologize. Maybe if I hold it right here, you guys can still see like a good color representation of this. So this palette, I really do like the color story of this, and I've always said this is one of my favorite Juvia's Place palettes, and it still is, but now my collection of green eyeshadows and orangey eyeshadows and things like that has grown and exploded, and it's in brands where I like the formula a lot more. So like I have some palettes that are from BH Cosmetics and things like that where I just like the greens and the oranges a bit better than what I find in here. So specifically, I've been holding on to this palette for these 2 shades, the Coral shade and the Cuba shade. And I absolutely love layering them together. This Coral shade is like a limey green version of like Electric from the Subculture palette from ABH. But this is a beautiful shadow on its own, but it's also a really pretty like topper shadow. Like I'm going to put a little bit of it over this Cuba shade just so you can kind of like get an idea of it. It's just so pretty. So that's really the only 2 shadows that I like to come into and use this palette for. And again, much like with the Nomad America's Parks palette, like I just don't want to hang on to things where it's like I don't love all of you, or at least half of you, you know what I mean? I cannot hang on to this 9-pan palette specifically for 2 eyeshadows in here. So the Juvia's Place mattes, I've always found them to be a little bit more on the drier side, a little bit harder to work with, like not not unusable, but just not my favorite, you know. And I feel like the mattes in here are drier than like the matte shadows in my Festival palette, which is actually my hands down favorite Juvia's Place palette. Now the shimmers from Juvia's Place are always so impactful, so nice and smooth and buttery. But again, when I look at these shimmers as a whole, that center one is a bronzy shimmer shade, which you guys know I do not like to use. I just feel like those types of shadows make me look sick. And then this one down here is like kind of an orangey red shimmer, and it's not bad. I have enjoyed like when I have used it the few times, but it's just not a favorite shade. It's not a shade that I actually will ever want to use or build a look around, I don't think. So that is really why I'm trying to force myself, I hate to say it that way, but I am trying to force myself to use these two palettes to see, do they have a place within my collection? Alright, so to wrap this up, let me just give you a few little statistical points. We started out this chopping block with 10 palettes, so we have already went through 5 of them and assessed them. We have decluttered 3 palettes and kept 2 palettes. So I am really on a roll as far as do I make smart purchasing decisions. But that is it. I'm not going to ramble anymore. I appreciate you guys sticking around and making it until the end of the video. I hope you're having a good day, a good night, or a good whatever, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye.